This podcast is brought to you by LMU Munich.
So I try to keep it below 20 minutes so that we have some time for discussion. When I woke up this morning, I had about 45 slides with me. That was a tiny bit too much. So what I've done is I've basically removed all of them. I've even removed the content so that just the headlines stay. And we can have a bit more of a conversation during this talk. If questions come during the talk, just throw them at me if something's not understandable. And I hope afterwards there is time for the discussion. And if not, we're going to use the coffee break and meet at the coffee desk, I guess. My name's Johannes. I just want to quickly say hello. I'm a Python developer. That's what I do for a living since quite a few years. And in different setups, I've been struggling with one theme that always came back. It's the dependencies. And whoever had to deal with dependencies, I guess some of you do projects with Python maybe, who likes handling dependencies? Zero. It's not too many. Who struggled with dependencies? Anybody ever? Maybe you have seen somebody struggling with dependencies. What I did see is that there are people trying to figure it out. They lose time. And somehow they get it working. In the end, just setting it up again from scratch. Doing that at scale with a bunch of teams, each team having 5 developers, that is expensive. So that is where my motivation comes from, to think about what to do with these dependencies. I thought that I got it, doesn't really work as expected. I thought that I got it figured out, but then I learned about this new thing. The perspective I'm talking about, just the developer's perspective. There is more, of course. You want to operate your application. You might have legal implications. You might want to know exactly what is in your dependency tree due to legal reasons. You might, okay, I'll leave it there. You might want to know if you are complying to what is required from some legal department. All these things, not for today. So what I'm looking at is, how do I get my job done as a developer? How could I help my team? If I'm in charge, if I'm the expert handling something like dependencies, how could I help my team so that they could just get started easily? Bunch of years ago, maybe 3 to 4, I met someone, a colleague, on a new job, and he was using this tool called Nixs, which is a package manager. Often you hear these words like purely functional and so on. I'm quite pragmatic about this. For me, it's a build tool. It's basically it knows how to build a package. And it has its description language, so it knows what do I need to build a package. So it gets all the stuff, it builds it for me, and afterwards I have some sort of a result. And I have a working application which I can then use to run it. So how does that look like? Let's not update this now. So the question is, how does it look like? That's the one slide where it looks a bit ugly, but I really wanted to show this. Typically, when you use it as a build tool and you are building something, it looks like this on the command line. You're saying, I want to build this thing here being called pip2nix and a little bit, and then it tells you I'm going to build all these things and I'm going to grab all these other things from the internet. And afterwards, you have a symlink called result, and inside you find your application, and you're able to run it. So much for the introduction to that. Look at the bottom. I will skip the store, so we don't want to waste too much time on that. Basically, in my case, I have this result bin pip2nix. I can run it, and my application is there. So that's the setting. Okay, that doesn't help me with development at all yet. There's this other concept. So Nixs has the solution how to build software, how to build it reproducible, how to build it in a way so that you exactly know which dependencies went in there, all these things. And it has a tool that's called shell, which is basically there as a debugging tool of the build process. It allows you to enter an environment which is very similar to the environment that you have when you actually build a package. So then this is interesting for me as a developer, because I thought, okay, such an environment, having all dependencies that I need, Python, thinking of C stuff. Anybody ever used like LXML or stuff like that? Where you need libxml to be available, libxslt to be available, and all your colleagues shall have it available in the right version, the same version as in production. That can be tricky. Okay, if this thing can give me that stuff and an environment, a shell, which has these dependencies available for me to develop, that could work. So that's the way of how I think about it. So I just want to get all these things there and do my Python stuff, since I like to do Python. I don't want to worry about how do I get exactly the right version of this C stuff or whatever, and some patches applied that we need in our setting. That's, as long as I'm not maintaining this environment, I don't want to worry about it. I just want to say, get me started, and I start working. That's my intention. Just looking at it to scare you a little bit. It comes with its own language. From my opinion, it does make sense to have this. That is a simple version of how you describe a package. Basically say, on the top you see this thing has a name called sample, based on this PyPA sample project on GitHub. I've just added a few things as dependencies there. You see line 11 and 12. There is peppercorn, Python thing. There is LXML. If I would run this and build it, it would go and pull all the right things for me. I would have them. If I give this to a colleague, it works as well. So from there, looking into this shell thing as a development environment, there's basically, I get an environment that it feels similar to the usual terminal that you're in. I can go and I have some nodes to tune things if I have project-specific needs. I would not recommend to start that way, but it's possible. My experience when trying this out, also in a team context with many people or many projects, the key is to start simple and then slowly explore this thing, because I've seen quite a few people trying to go full in with everything in one step. That kind of punches back into your face. That's not my recommended way of trying this. So let's look at the workflow. It's not too complicated. It's there, line 1. This is the manual, how you get started as a developer, if somebody provides it for you. Doesn't look too complicated, does it? It's just this. We had, I've tried this on fairly complex projects, needing like a bunch of Python dependencies. Okay, that's doable. Needing a bunch of specific C dependencies, some of them adjusted. I wanted them in the same way as in production, and I didn't want to make it too complicated for everybody involved to get this started. And I was brave enough to say, people, you could try this on Linux, well, and on your Mac, let's see what happens. I wanted to find this out. Turns out this works okay. If you have a typical Python-based web project, you target a Linux environment, you usually want to develop as close as possible to production. But I also wanted to know how far can I go. So my state currently is, in many cases, it works flawless and fine to spread the development across Linux and OS X. In many cases, it works just fine. And it works also fine if you provide this to a team of people and they don't know all internals of this tool, basically you just have to make sure that you provide sane defaults so that they can run one command, watch a few minutes how the internet gets downloaded onto their machine, and afterwards they can basically start to do their job. That's the moment when people like it, in my experience. There is an advanced level, of course. You can do more as your project grows, as it gets more complicated. I've found that usually you end up doing either different files where you say, okay, this is what you need for the typical development, and maybe you provide certain tools and you just want to make it easy to get them available. So then you have a bunch of such environments. That does work fairly well. There's one thing specific to Python. In my experience with the typical web project, there is usually a bunch of requirements. We see that in a setup py file. We do see that in a requirements file. And we want to get those in the version that we use for our application. And if we are on I've seen that when building a web application, in a team or many teams and targeting one deployment, then it's common that we keep these requirements pinned down and up to date as we go. And we want that all our colleagues can get these updates easily without having to worry about it. If you do this, and in my first attempt, like 3 years ago, I tried to do that manually, that does work, but you are going to write a lot of so-called Nixs expressions, and that is not what you want to do, because you would like to get as much out of the existing Python ecosystem so that you only have to do the tiny bits. And that is where some automation kicks in. So there are some tools outside. The two of them I mentioned here, which I tried both. One of them, I'm currently the maintainer. I hope that we can merge these two tools at some point. But what they do is basically they freeze these requirements into this Nixs language so that the manual work of keeping this thing up to date gets reduced. It's not what I recommend for starting, but it's typically what makes sense after you did the first steps. When you discover there is a lot of manual maintenance involved, then this is a thing that gets you 80% automated, and the remaining part is when you have to tweak. Like say, if you generate dependencies from LXML, it doesn't know that it needs libxml2. So that is what the 20% you still have to put in. This does work fairly well. My typical setup, the first file, the default Nixs, describes my application. Then I have this, the third file, which is Python packages.nix. That's basically the frozen requirements automatically generated with tooling. And then there is this file above it called overrides. This is the manual labor involved. And in my experience, you have to write this once, and most of the lifetime, it's going to stay static. So you can get quite far with this approach, and it works quite okay. So much the introduction. What did I learn during the last year? So I'm not going to show you more technical details about Nixs itself. My recommendation is looking at it, trying it. That makes sense. If you conclude you want to go further into it, there are a few things I had to learn the hard way, which I wanted to mention. Because it's not the typical thing you would use in Python development. That means if you are a group of people, you need someone who helps. So at least one person in that group needs some time to learn this thing and to become the expert of that. Otherwise, it's going to be frustrating. I've been there without the expert, was not nice. Well, I did learn it because of that, but that's what I learned the hard way. Somebody has to invest a few days just to get good enough at it to help to make it smooth. That's critical. Otherwise, you throw a potentially really useful tool away just because you approach it the hard way. There is another thing about it. It has its own package set. That is what, from other Linux distributions, you would think of all the packages which are there defined. When you work with this, you have a thing called a channel, and basically you update it. So sometimes you get what has been changed in the community into your machine. This implies, if you do work this way, that every team member has a different version they might point to. Imagine you're running a Debian-like system. Some people do an update, some not, so things diverge. This can lead to trouble, especially if you follow the unstable branch. That means where the development happens in the package set, there might be breaking changes. That's how I learned it. We had this, all of my team got the breaking changes in. They were all visiting me at the same time in the morning, crying for help. So I thought, okay, from that point on, I'll better pin it down to a version, and I decide when the update rolls in. This way, I can be a little bit behind what's going on in the unstable community development. I can still benefit from it, but I can run it first through CI. I can get it into my box, see if that's smooth, and afterwards, I update the pinning so that it rolls through the team. This avoids a lot of trouble and makes the experience of trying this out a lot better. This one, I do believe I did mention. I mention it again. Honestly, from the last 3-4 years, I think it's definitely a very interesting tool if it matches your case. If you are targeting Linux, it probably matches. If you have a mix of different things, it also probably matches. Still, give yourself the time to start small. Baby steps. Read the manual. I will come to that. And I also mentioned in the beginning, this is just a tiny, tiny bit in the development environment. This is just for the developer. So the goal here is run a command, get started. Obviously, there are more use cases to this. When you think of the whole picture again, going back a little bit, there should be some CI. You want to run the application thinking of terms of deployment. That's where it gets onto the next level of being interesting. Because you could say, I use this tool for the whole chain, and you have a very good understanding and very good reliability of what you have in these different stages. It's very hard to get this mixed up. Yeah. That's the main lesson learned. Apart from starting small, I'm not thinking about CI here, not about deployment pipeline, just development environment. It's this tiny thing on every developer's machine. It's where I think automation has to happen in the sense of when you update your requirements, when you maintain them. Because otherwise it's going to be a tedious task, and that's demotivating, and you would not do it, and you would end up with very outdated things in your application. That's not good. How's the timing, actually? So I have a few pointers, and I will only mention why I put them here once, and I do believe then we can get into some conversation. So that's also a lesson I had to learn. I did learn it the hard way. It took me about a year to find out that this thing has many manuals. I thought there is only one thing called Nixs. Okay, I didn't know the package set has a manual as well. So my advice, if you're going to start it and try that out, there is this manual about the package manager. It has a description of the language. I've tried different approaches since I was able to advise people in different teams how to approach it. What worked best is telling somebody, hey, take up to a day, read this chapter about the language. It's a tiny language. Afterwards, this person was able to just move freely and fast with that environment. The same thing without suggesting someone to read the manual first, especially this chapter. They struggled about half a year until they got it under control. That's also how I learned it. So I learned it the hard way. In some cases, it makes sense to take parts of those manuals. The other bit is the second link on the screen. The package set itself has a manual, and it's worth reading if you use this approach or try it, because it contains a kind of a utility library, and it tells you the functionality which is used, how it works, how it's intended. And once you got the rough picture, jump into the code and continue reading there. That makes sense. Let's skip the code, and let's finish with the community. That is a project, it's quite vibrant. There is an active IRC, good mailing list. I do believe it's easy to get in touch with those people. Some of them sometimes also run around on conferences and have stickers. So definitely, if you try it out and you see this might be my thing, it works for my case. Apart from looking at manuals, those people are really nice and helpful, so that makes sense to look there. Okay, I would stop the slides at this point so that we can maybe, I don't know how the time is, but maybe we can take 1 or 2 questions or also comments. There is one thing, the community is trying to organize its second conference. I do believe it's autumn this year around Munich, so it might be interesting as well.
Yes, okay, any question, please? Anybody? Yes, please.
So I'm an advocate doctor here anyway, but what's the benefit of having Nixs over something Docker-like, which is fairly well established in the development community right now already?
Yep, so I try to repeat the question. If I got it right, it's why don't we use Docker? What's the difference? So what's the benefit? How do I say it in nice words for both projects? I do believe both technologies have their solve a problem, and they do provide, and they can be used to provide development environments in a more or less repeatable way. And I do believe they both work for this case quite okay. The difference I see is when I build a Docker, I'm not so strict about what gets in there. I might not have pinned the base image down so exactly. And I have some stuff in there building the different images, like, say, running NPM and so on. So it's not so predictable what really did happen here. The contrary, in the Nixs world, it calculates a dependency graph, everything that gets pulled into the machine. There is a hash over it. We compare, is this the expected hash or did it change? And only then stuff is pulled in and built and so on. So I do believe that is the main difference. Apart from, I do think Docker targets a bit a different thing. So looking at the whole picture, with Docker, I think it solves a different problem. It does not solve the dependency problem, I do believe.
Yeah. Any other question?
As far as I know, there's also an operating system behind Nixs. How much do you lose in terms of the functionality of the package manager if you are using Nixs on Debian, let's say? Or as far as I understood it, you don't need the operating system, right?
Very good point. So the question was, there is an operating system. If I use Nixs as a package manager, how much do I use this operating system? Will my Mac afterwards be a NixOS Mac? No, it won't. The package manager itself, it's fairly decoupled. Technically, it creates a directory, /Nixs, and that's where it does put all this stuff. Apart from that, you will have 1, 2 symlinks, but otherwise it does not get into conflict with your existing system. And that is a key advantage. You can use that on Debian, whatever Linux. On macOS, it works fairly nice. And it does not mess with your system, not at all. So you can use NixOS. I would recommend trying it out eventually, but there is no need for it, especially not for a development environment. Yeah.
Any other question? No?
Maybe as a short follow-up, for instance, if you have OpenSSL's dependency, would it then reuse your Mac supplied version, Where's the boundary between the operating system and the package manager?
Okay. So, second question on that is, where's the boundary to the operating system? Example, the SSL library. Where does it come from? Operating system? Something else. The answer to that is, it does come from somewhere else. Everything, down to bootstrapping the compiler, comes out of what Nixs calls the Nixs store. So you are completely isolated from your operating system, which you might have around. That I do believe is a key advantage. You don't mess up your development environment with your operating system, and also not the other way around. And yeah, there was one concern: does it compile everything? That is maybe relevant. No, it does not. If things go wrong, it will do this, yes. But it has, due to all this hashing involved and being quite sure about which were the inputs to build a certain binary, it can do binary substitutes, which means it goes to a cache and downloads binaries. So for 90% of your dependencies, you should get precompiled binaries in, and only for your custom stuff, you will see it compiling stuff.
Okay, if there is no question left, I will say thank you very much. And we have now a coffee break, 1/2 hour. And